trying to reach across the dimensions to save us from the momentum of our history by making us aware of, first of all, their existence and also their technology, which is evolving toward a point where I think around the Mayan millennium, around 2012, the time island we will flow past the time island, and the two time streams will be rejoined, and we will make peace with this civilization, which is now 1,000 years more advanced than us, with this totally different cultural history and this completely different take on reality. So this came to me in the space of about 15 seconds. And more details have flowed in, and I use it mostly as a meditational device because it's so interesting to ask to be told about how this other civilization developed. Its amazing exoticism, its Neoplatonism, its Taoism, its Mayan influences melded into a completely different kind of civilization than the one that we inherited. I've always thought, that Christianity, without making any judgment about Christ himself, that Christianity is hands down the single most reactionary force in all of human history. And where would we be had that 1,200 years not been given over to this peculiar meditation, All the pieces were in place for the kind of civilization that I've outlined. It was just a coincidence. Kat does not endorse this idea or even encourage it.
He only told it to me a couple of days ago in Apache Junction in a truck stop or something, and he didn't tell me it as the plot for a science fiction novel. He said, this is the truth. And then I said, let's get back to it being a good science fiction novel.
Well, the thing is, it would, on our level, explain perhaps the questions you were asking earlier of why the teaching plants.
Sure.
Yeah.
Another thing I was curious while you were talking about this is the physics of nowadays. It's like if you have an electron on one side of the universe and split it into two and separate them by the universe, they're still in communication with each other. So is that why, logically, you can bring the time island back together again?
Yeah, this would be a quantum mechanical super macrophysical Bell's theorem event, a kind of hyperdimensional vacuum fluctuation where the two worlds spring apart, sail along for a period, and then parity is conserved and they're rejoined.
Well, this is interesting. I've had dreams that
yes.
are parallel what you're
Dreams
describing
really
here,
like
and
that.
it's very interesting that you bring this up. I've not heard of it before. And another thing I was curious is, like, this takes place in, this would be on a human experience level, what you're speaking of. Now, with the plant kingdom, would they remain in connection between the species?
We're free to have it any way we like.
So it's how has Christianity possibly affected the evolution of plant species in this time stream, as opposed to the other? Have they gone on varying?
How does our lack of, say, 100,000 or million species in the last 200 years that the other planet has, how does that affect the parity between the two?
You mean, how does our destruction and contort...
Exactly.
Well, the part of the myth that I didn't tell you, which I will now tell you, was that naturally, they were developing and exploring technical options many hundreds of years ago, and they discovered the theoretics for nuclear fusion and fission, but they never used it until a few hundred years later. One of their great theoreticians, this was after they had discovered our time stream, made the prediction that the physics of atomic explosions were such that they would cross the time stream. And so they performed an experiment by detonating an atomic device in what is our year 1907. And this was
Yes,
the
where? Can anyone guess?
the Tunguska event. And then by monitoring the dreams of Siberian shaman, which they had in clear focus, they saw, this explosion which we set off actually did occur in both time streams. And at that point, they became very interested in monitoring our time stream because they were picking up the dreams of a Swiss telegraph worker who seemed to be pushing toward an unimaginable conclusion. So now there is a certain amount of urgency because if we explode our atomic stockpiles, it will wreck the place that they call homeworld. Yes. Yes, not self-preservation because they now have starflight and encompass many systems, but preservation of homeworld, which on the other side is a vast botanical and ecological preserve from pole to pole. I mean, it's a sacred site of pilgrimage. It's the home of the species. It's the earth. And the notion that suddenly great parts of it will be blown apart by leakage from hyperspace of one of our atomic wars is impelling them now to attempt to open the doorway and rejoin the time streams, and we'll be allowed a few years inside the botanical park to acclimate, and then most people will ship off for the stars, I imagine. The British science fiction writer Ian Watson has a wonderful book called Chekhov's Journey, in which he talks about the Tunguska event, and his theory is that it was a catastrophic failure of a Soviet time travel experiment conducted shortly after the turn of the next century.
Tough one to prove, right?
Obviously. Why didn't we think of that? Well, I mean, I'm not sure. I've thought of that before. You know, it's the claim of Christian theologians that Christ comes in the center of history. They speak this same language. Before Christ, no souls were entering heaven. He freed the valve, and now it's possible to enter into heaven. Before his intercession, that was impossible. You're right, but that's where I left them, was pre-Vatican II. Before I had this idea, I had another idea, which I'll tell you, which is a completely different kind of idea. And it's the idea that there is an overmind. This doesn't involve other dimensions. There is an overmind co-present on this planet. And when the development of technology exceeds the development of ethics, then this overmind can work miracles. And because the overmind is plugged into each of the individual minds that compose it, this miracle always has this unbelievably creepy quality of being exactly the thing which would convince you to change your mind. I mean, in other words, it's like it reads you so perfectly that it's able to present the one situation which you cannot refuse. So in the case of Rome, it was that, Rome was a pigsty. Pasternak called it a bargain basement on 2 floors. It ran on slavery, and it ran on brutality and captive populations and an outrageous garrisoning of military power in foreign lands. And people like Diophantus, this mathematician I mentioned, and hero of Alexandria, these people were on the brink of the calculus and the steam engine. So the overmind, seeing that and seeing their appalling ethical state, sent the miraculous personage of Christ, who, in a world where information could not move faster than a horse's gallop, this religion within 60 years was beating at the gates of Rome itself. It was like fire, just burned through the empire and changed everything and halted technical advance, and everything stopped. Now, I created this idea in an effort to explain the UFOs, because, the new theory of UFOs, or the new